Growing up in the small town of Millridge, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, legends were a part of life. There were countless tales of strange creatures and unexplained disappearances, but none gripped the town's collective imagination more than the story of the Silver Hollow cryptid. According to local lore, Silver Hollow, our dense, mist-covered valley just outside town, was home to a creature that defied logic and description. Farmers spoke of missing livestock, hikers disappeared without a trace, and some swore they saw glowing eyes staring at them from the shadows. The older folks called it the Wendigo, others referred to it as a skinwalker, but most simply called it the Beast. As a teenager, I dismissed these tales as nothing more than spooky campfire stories. That changed one summer night when my best friends, Ethan and Cassie, convinced me to explore Silver Hollow. "Come on, Liam," Ethan urged, grinning as he adjusted the straps on his backpack. "It's just a bit of harmless fun. Besides, don't you want to see if there's any truth to the stories?" Cassie rolled her eyes. "Ethan, you just want an excuse to freak us out." The truth was, I didn't believe in the beast, but I couldn't shake the unease that came with venturing into the hollow. The stories were too vivid, too consistent, and most unsettling of all, too numerous. But peer pressure won out, and soon we were trudging through the dense forest, flashlights in hand. The air grew colder as we descended into the hollow. The trees were unnaturally tall, their gnarled branches twisting together to form an almost impenetrable canopy. The deeper we went, the more the silence pressed in around us. Even the usual sounds of the forest chirping crickets, rustling leaves, seemed to vanish. "This place is creepy," Cassie whispered, clutching her flashlight tightly. Ethan laughed nervously. "It's just a bunch of trees. No beast here." As if on cue, a low, guttural growl echoed through the woods. We froze, our flashlights darting wildly in search of the source. "What was that?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Probably a bear," Ethan said, though his bravado was slipping. Bears didn't growl like that. Whatever made that sound was bigger, angrier. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but Ethan pressed on, determined to prove his point. Cassie and I reluctantly followed. The trail led us to a clearing, the heart of Silver Hollow. In the center stood an ancient, crumbling stone structure, its purpose long forgotten. The air here was thick, almost suffocating, and a faint metallic smell lingered, like rust or blood. "What is this place?" Cassie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "No idea," Ethan admitted, stepping closer to the structure. "But it's definitely creepy." That's when we saw the tracks, massive, clawed impressions in the soft earth. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen, far too large for any known animal. My stomach churned as I traced their path with my flashlight. The tracks circled the clearing before disappearing into the shadows. "We should leave," I said, my voice tight with fear. Ethan opened his mouth to argue, but another growl cut him off, this one much closer. The sound reverberated through the clearing, primal and menacing. Then we saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, a hulking mass that seemed to melt into the darkness. But as it stepped into the moonlight, its form became horrifyingly clear. The creature stood on two legs, towering over us, with a body covered in matted fur. Its elongated snout bristled with razor-sharp teeth, and its glowing yellow eyes burned with an almost human intelligence. "The beast!" Cassie screamed, and Ethan dropped his flashlight in shock. I grabbed their arms, dragging them back toward the trail. The creature let out a deafening roar, the sound almost paralyzing in its intensity. We ran blindly through the dull forest, branches whipping at our faces, our breaths coming in ragged gasps. The beast was behind us, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground. I dared to glance back and saw it gaining on us, its movements unnervingly fluid for something so massive. "Over here!" Ethan shouted, pointing to a cluster of boulders. We scrambled up, hoping the height would slow it down. The beast stopped at the base, snarling and pacing like a predator, toying with its prey. Its eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, everything else faded away. In those glowing orbs, I saw a hunger that went beyond physical need, a hunger for fear, for domination. It was then I realized the truth. The beast wasn't just an animal. It was something ancient, something evil. The creature lunged at the boulders, its claws scraping against the rock. Cassie sobbed, clinging to me, while Ethan frantically searched for anything that could be used as a weapon. He found a large branch and swung it at the beast, but it only seemed to enrage it further. Just when I thought it would reach us, a sharp, piercing whistle cut through the air. The beast froze, its ears twitching, before retreating into the shadows with an almost reluctant growl. The forest fell silent once more. We didn't wait to see what had scared it off. We climbed down and ran, not stopping until we reached the safety of Ethan's car. As we drove away, I glanced back at the forest. For a split second, I thought I saw a pair of glowing eyes watching us from the tree line. We never spoke about what happened in Silver Hollow, not to each other, not to anyone. But the beast haunted my dreams, its eyes a constant reminder of the terror we faced. I don't know what called it off that night, and I'm not sure I want to. The stories were true, the beast was real, and it's still out there, waiting in the shadows of Silver Hollow. Black Ridge Swamp was a place shrouded in mystery, a vast expanse of murky water and twisted cypress trees that stretched for miles. It wasn't the kind of place you'd visit for fun. Locals said it was cursed, that strange lights danced over the water at night, and that people who wandered too far into the swamp often didn't come back. But I wasn't a local. I was a journalist, and I thought I was above superstition. My name is Ben Harris, and at the time, I was chasing a story about a cryptid known as the Swamp Stalker. Descriptions of the creature varied. Some said it looked like an enormous reptilian beast with glowing red eyes, while others swore it had the body of a man but moved like an animal. The only thing witnesses agreed on was that it wasn't natural. It was late spring when I arrived in Black Ridge, our town so small it barely registered on a map. The air was thick with humidity, and the swamp buzzed with the sound of unseen insects. My contact, an elderly man named Earl, met me at the diner on the edge of town. "You don't want to go out there?" Earl said, shaking his head. "That thing in the swamp, it's not just some animal, it's something else." "Something else?" I asked, scribbling in my notebook. "What do you mean?" Earl leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It's a curse, son. My granddaddy used to say the swamp was home to a spirit, something old and angry. People who disturb it, they don't come back the same, if they come back at all." Despite Earl's warnings, I decided to press on. I wasn't about to let local legends scare me off a potential Pulitzer-worthy story. Armed with a flashlight, a camera, and a small boat I'd rented from the bait shop, I set out into the swamp just before sunset. The further I ventured, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The cypress trees seemed to close in around me, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The water was eerily still, its surface reflecting the deep orange of the setting sun. I had just reached a clearing in the swamp when I noticed something unusual. A set of tracks, impossibly large and clawed, pressed into the muddy bank. My heart raced as I snapped a few pictures. This was it evidence of the swamp stalker. But then I heard it, a low, guttural growl that sent a shiver down my spine. The sounds seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I turned in circles, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but I couldn't see anything. The growl came again, closer this time, and I realized with growing dread that whatever was making it was circling me. I climbed back into my boat, paddling furiously toward what I hoped was the way out. The growl turned into a roar, and I caught a glimpse of something massive moving through the trees. Its eyes glowed like embers, and its body was a patchwork of scales and fur, as if it had been cobbled together from parts of different animals. Panic set in as the creature charged toward the water. My boat rocked violently as it swam beneath me, the ripple of its movement causing waves that nearly capsized me. I paddled harder, my arms burning with effort, but the swamp seemed endless. Just when I thought I couldn't go on, I spotted a faint light in the distance. It was coming from a small cabin perched on stilts in the middle of the swamp. I made my way toward it, praying whoever lived there would help me. An elderly woman opened the door as I stumbled onto the porch, out of breath and shaking. Her expression was one of mild annoyance, as if she'd been expecting me. "You saw it, didn't you?" she asked, her voice calm. "Yes," I managed to gasp. "What is it?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she handed me a cup of something hot and bitter, motioning for me to sit. "The stalker is the spirit of the swamp," she finally said. "It guards this place, keeps people out who don't belong." I didn't understand. "Why me? I wasn't doing anything." "You were looking for it," she said simply. "That's enough." I stayed in the cabin that night, too terrified to venture back into the swamp. The woman, her name was Eliza, watched over me, her presence strangely comforting. She seemed to know the swamp better than anyone, and I wondered if she had some connection to the creature. By morning, the stalker was gone, and Eliza guided me back to the edge of the swamp. As I climbed out of the boat, she gave me a warning I'll never forget. "Leave the swamp alone, and it'll leave you alone." I left Blackridge that day, my notebook full of unanswered questions, and my camera holding grainy photos that couldn't possibly convey the terror I'd felt. I never wrote the article, deciding some stories weren't meant to be told. The swamp stalker is still out there, waiting in the shadows of Blackridge Swamp. And if you're smart, you'll stay far, far away. Greystone Gorge was known for its rugged beauty, a sprawling canyon of jagged cliffs and dense forest that stretched as far as the eye could see. To hikers and adventurers, it was a dream destination. To the locals, it was a place to avoid once the sun went down. Stories about strange howls echoing through the gorge at night had circulated for years, and those who dared to investigate rarely came back with answers, if they came back at all. My name is Andrew Carter, and I had heard the tales since I was a child. Growing up in the nearby town of Red Pines, the legend of the Greystone Howler was a favorite campfire story. It was said to be a massive beast, part wolf, part man, with razor-sharp claws and eyes that glowed like lanterns in the dark. I never believed it, at least, not until the night I came face to face with it. It was late fall, the air crisp and the leaves a mosaic of red and gold. I had returned to Red Pines, after years of living in the city, looking for a break from the chaos of urban life. My best friend, Mark, convinced me to join him on a camping trip to Greystone Gorge. He was a local guide and an experienced outdoorsman, and his excitement about the trip was infectious. "We'll stick to the trails," Mark assured me as we loaded our gear into his truck. It's perfectly safe as long as we don't wander off. We arrived at the gorge just before sunset, the sky streaked with shades of pink and orange. The trail wound its way through the forest, the sound of crunching leaves underfoot the only noise breaking the silence. We set up camp near the edge of a small clearing, the towering cliffs casting long shadows as darkness fell. That night, as we sat around the fire, Mark brought up the legend of the Howler. "They say it's a guardian of the gorge," he said, poking at the flames with a stick. "It doesn't bother you unless you trespass into its territory." I rolled my eyes. "You don't really believe that, do you?" Mark shrugged. "I've never seen it, but I've heard it. Sometimes when I've been out here alone, I've heard the howls." We laughed it off and turned in for the night, but sleep didn't come easily. The forest was alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, the rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl keeping me on edge. Then, just as I was starting to drift off, I heard it. A low, mournful howl that sent a chill down my spine. I sat up, straining to hear, and the howl came again, longer this time and closer. Mark was already awake, his face pale in the dim light of the fire. "Stay here," he whispered, grabbing his flashlight and stepping out of the tent. Against my better judgment, I followed him. The howls grew louder as we moved toward the source, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The forest felt different now, oppressive and menacing, as if it were holding its breath. We reached a rocky outcrop overlooking the gorge, and that's when we saw it. Standing on a ledge across the canyon was a creature unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was massive, its body covered in thick, dark fur that shimmered in the moonlight. Its eyes glowed an unnatural yellow, and its elongated snout revealed sharp, gleaming teeth. The Howler. It let out a roar that echoed through the gorge, the sound so loud it felt like the ground was shaking. Mark and I froze, paralyzed by fear. The creature stared at us for what felt like an eternity before turning and disappearing into the shadows. We ran back to camp, our hearts pounding in unison. The rest of the night was a blur of whispered debates and frantic packing. By sunrise, we were back in Mark's truck, speeding away from Greystone Gorge. Over the following days, I tried to make sense of what we'd seen. Mark and I agreed not to tell anyone. It wasn't a story people would believe, and neither of us wanted to be branded as lunatics, but the encounter stayed with me, haunting my dreams and gnawing at the edges of my sanity. A week later, I decided to go back. I don't know what compelled me to return. Curiosity, perhaps, or a desperate need for answers. Armed with a camera and a recorder, I ventured into the gorge alone, determined to document the creature. The forest felt even more foreboding this time, the shadows deeper and the air heavier. I retraced our steps to the rocky outcrop, my heart hammering in my chest. Hours passed without a sign of the Howler, and I began to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. Then I heard it, the howl, low and mournful, echoing through the gorge. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as the sound grew closer. I raised my camera, aiming it toward the ledge where we'd seen the creature, but it was nowhere to be found. Suddenly a growl came from behind me. I turned, and there it was, standing no more than 20 feet away. Its eyes burned with an intelligence that was almost human, and for a moment I thought it might attack. But instead, it simply watched me, its expression unreadable. Slowly, I lowered my camera and backed away, my instincts screaming at me to run. The Howler didn't follow. It stood there, a silent sentinel, as if it were warning me not to return. I left Greystone Gorge that day, vowing never to set foot there again. To this day, I don't know what the creature was or why it let me go. But I do know one thing. The legend of the Howler is real, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. I don't know what compelled me to return. Curiosity, perhaps, or a desperate need for answers. Armed with a camera and a recorder, I ventured into the gorge alone, determined to document the creature. The forest felt even more foreboding this time, the shadows deeper and the air heavier. I retraced our steps to the rocky outcrop, my heart hammering in my chest. Hours passed without a sign of the Howler, and I began to wonder if I'd imagined the whole thing. Then I heard it, the howl, low and mournful, echoing through the gorge. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as the sound grew closer. I raised my camera, aiming it toward the ledge where we'd seen the creature, but it was nowhere to be found. Suddenly a growl came from behind me. I turned, and there it was, standing no more than 20 feet away. Its eyes burned with an intelligence that was almost human, and for a moment I thought it might attack. But instead, it simply watched me, its expression unreadable. Slowly, I lowered my camera and backed away, my instincts screaming at me to run. The Howler didn't follow. It stood there, a silent sentinel, as if it were warning me not to return. I left Greystone Gorge that day, vowing never to set foot there again. To this day, I don't know what the creature was or why it let me go. But I do know one thing. The legend of the Howler is real, and some mysteries are better left unsolved. I've always been drawn to the wilderness. There's something serene about the quiet hum of nature, the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze, and the scent of earth after rain. When my cousin, Emma, invited me to join her on a week-long camping trip deep in the Appalachians, I didn't hesitate. It was an escape from the noise of my city life and an opportunity to reconnect with my roots. Emma and I had grown up exploring the woods near our grandparents' farm, and we were no strangers to the outdoors. She had recently taken up cryptozoology as a hobby, fascinated by tales of creatures that defied logic. Her latest obsession was the cryptid, known as the Wendigo. She insisted we camp in an area notorious for its sightings, though I dismissed it as folklore. We arrived at the site mid-morning, the sun streaming through the canopy in golden shafts. The area was breathtaking, surrounded by towering trees whose trunks were gnarled and ancient. As we set up camp, Emma regaled me with the Wendigo's lore, a malevolent creature born of greed and desperation, stalking those who dared to enter its territory. People swear they hear whispers in the trees, she said, her voice tinged with excitement, like it's watching them. Or it's just the wind, I replied, rolling my eyes. You're too deep into this, Em. The first 2 days were uneventful, filled with hikes and the simple joy of disconnecting from technology. On the third night, things began to change. We sat by the fire, its warm glow warding off the chill that crept into the air after sunset. The woods around us seemed darker, the usual nighttime sounds muted. Emma was fiddling with her voice recorder, hoping to capture some evidence of the Wendigo's presence. "Do you feel that?" she asked suddenly, her voice low. "Feel what?" I replied. "The air. It's heavy." I hadn't noticed it before, but she was right. There was a suffocating stillness, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Then came the whispers, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to emanate from the trees. "Probably just the wind," I said, though my voice betrayed my unease. Emma shushed me, pointing her recorder toward the sound. The whispers grew louder, circling us like an invisible predator. I tried to focus, to make out words, but it was like listening to a language I'd never heard before. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like something was watching me, its presence palpable yet unseen. Emma, on the other hand, seemed thrilled by the experience. She spent the morning reviewing her recordings, though she wouldn't let me listen. "It's faint," she said, her brow furrowed. "But it's there." "What's there?" "A voice. It keeps saying, 'Leave.'" We debated cutting the trip short, but Emma was adamant about staying. She was convinced we were on the verge of discovering something extraordinary. Reluctantly, I agreed. That evening, we ventured deeper into the woods, Emma clutching her camera and recorder like talismans. The whispers returned, louder this time, and with them came a new sound, a low growl that sent shivers down my spine, The invitation to join a group of friends for a weekend retreat in the mountains came at the perfect time. Life had been chaotic, and I needed an escape. Hollow Ridge, a secluded area surrounded by dense forests and known for its picturesque trails, sounded like the ideal getaway. Our group consisted of 6, Jenna and her boyfriend Matt, the adventurous pair who had planned the trip, Ryan, the outdoorsy one who knew every type of plant and animal by sight, Maya, who hated the idea of nature but loved Jenna too much to decline, and finally, Ethan and me. Ethan was my best friend since childhood, and we'd always been partners in crime when it came to adventures. We arrived late Friday afternoon. The cabin we rented was rustic but cozy, nestled in a clearing with a breathtaking view of the mountains. The air was crisp, and the scent of pine filled the atmosphere. We spent the first evening by the fire pit, laughing and roasting marshmallows under a canopy of stars. As the night deepened, Jenna brought up the local folklorious supposed cryptid that had been sighted in the area for decades. "They call it the Hollow Ridge Beast," she said, her voice dipping into a theatrical whisper. "Half man, half wolf, with glowing red eyes and claws that could tear through steel. They say it hunts at night, especially when there's a full moon." Ryan scoffed. "It's just a story to keep tourists entertained. Wolves, maybe, but a beast? Come on." Despite his skepticism, the tale left a chill in the air. We eventually retired to the cabin, brushing off the unease as simple campfire storytelling. The next morning, we set off on a hike. Ryan led the way, his boundless energy pulling us deeper into the wilderness. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. Yet, as we ventured further, the atmosphere changed. The woods grew eerily quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against your eardrums. "Anyone else notice how quiet it's gotten?" Maya asked, her voice breaking the stillness. "It's normal," Ryan said, though his pace slowed. "Predators might be nearby. Animals go silent when there's danger." Danger? The word hung in the air like a warning. As we rounded a bend, Ethan froze. "What the hell is that?" Ahead of us, embedded in the soft dirt, were enormous footprints. They resembled wolf tracks but were far too large, each one almost the size of a dinner plate. "Bear?" Matt suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. "Bears don't," have claws like this, Ryan said, crouching to examine the prints. These are different. The unease from the previous night crept back, stronger now. We decided to head back to the cabin, abandoning our plans to explore further. By the time we returned, the sun was beginning to set. Jenna suggested we stay inside for the evening, and no one argued. The tension was palpable, each of us silently replaying the sight of those tracks. That night, the forest came alive with unsettling sounds. A distant howl echoed through the trees, followed by the snap of branches. Probably just a wolf, Ryan said, though his tone betrayed him. The noises grew closer, and then we heard a guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through the walls of the cabin. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, a mix of a wolf's snarl and something deeper. Matt peeked out the window and froze. "Guys, you need to see this." Reluctantly, we gathered by the window. In the clearing stood a massive figure, its silhouette illuminated by the pale moonlight. It was bipedal but hunched, its elongated arms ending in claws that gleamed like steel. Its eyes glowed an unnatural red, piercing through the darkness. For a moment, none of us moved, paralyzed by the sheer impossibility of what we were seeing. Then it let out a roar, a sound so feral it shook the cabin. "Basement!" Jenna screamed, snapping us out of our stupor. We bolted for the basement, slamming the door behind us and barricading it with whatever we could find. The creature's footsteps thudded on the porch above, followed by the sound of wood splintering. "It's coming in," Maya whispered, her face pale. We huddled in the dark, holding our breath as the creature prowled above us. It growled and snarled, its heavy footsteps moving from room to room. Glass shattered, and furniture was overturned as it searched for us. Hours seemed to stretch into eternity. Eventually, the noises ceased, replaced by an oppressive silence. We waited, too afraid to move, until the first light of dawn seeped through the cracks in the floorboards. When we emerged, the cabin was a wreck. Claw marks scarred the walls, and the furniture was reduced to splinters. Whatever that thing was, it had left. We packed up and left Hollow Ridge that morning, our weekend retreat cut short. None of us spoke on the drive home, each lost in our thoughts. To this day, I don't know what we encountered that night. Some say it was just a wolf, a trick of the light, and our imaginations running wild. But I know what I saw. The Hollow. Ridge Beast is real, and it's out there, waiting for its next prey. The allure of the Appalachian Trail had always been strong for me. It wasn't just about the hike, but the sense of being in untouched wilderness, where time seemed to stand still. When my co-worker Jake suggested we explore a lesser-known part of the trail, I jumped at the opportunity. Our group was Small Jake, his girlfriend Elena, and me. Jake had heard of a hidden cave deep in the forest, said to be a natural wonder few had ventured to. Elena was hesitant, but eventually agreed, enticed by the promise of breathtaking views. We set off early, backpacks heavy with supplies and spirits high. The trail was rugged but manageable, winding through towering trees and over babbling brooks. Birds chirped above us, and the occasional rustle of leaves hinted at unseen wildlife. It was perfect. After a few hours, we veered off the main path, guided by Jake's map and a GPS app on his phone. The terrain grew steeper, the undergrowth denser. By midday, we reached the cave's entrance, a gaping maw in the side of a rocky hill, partially obscured by vines. "Here it is," Jake said triumphantly. The cave exuded an unsettling air, its dark depths seeming to pulse with a silent warning. Elena hesitated. "Are you sure this is safe?" she asked. "It'll be fine," Jake assured her. "We'll go in, take some pictures, and head back before it gets dark." Reluctantly, Elena and I followed him inside. The cave was vast, its walls glistening with moisture. Stalactites hung like jagged teeth from the ceiling, and the faint drip of water echoed in the stillness. We turned on our flashlights, their beams cutting through the darkness. Deeper we went, marveling at the natural formations. The air grew colder, the silence more oppressive. That's when we noticed the markings. Etched into the stone walls were strange symbols, spirals, jagged lines and shapes that defied explanation. They looked ancient, worn by time, but still distinct. "Maybe Native American?" Jake suggested, snapping photos. "Maybe we shouldn't be here," Elena murmured, her unease palpable. As we ventured further, the cave opened into a massive chamber. In the center stood a stone altar, its surface covered in more of the strange symbols. Around it were scattered bones, animal, I hoped, though their size made me uncertain. "What is this place?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Jake shrugged, his curiosity outweighing his caution. He approached the altar, examining it closely. "Don't touch anything," Elena warned, but Jake was already running his fingers over the carvings. The moment he did, the ground trembled. A low growl echoed through the chamber, reverberating in my chest. "What was that?" Eleanor gasped, clutching my arm. Before I could respond, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was massive, towering. Over us on two legs, its body was covered in matted fur, its face a grotesque mix of human and beast. Eyes like molten gold burned with malevolence, and its claws gleamed in the dim light. The Guardian. We froze, paralyzed by its presence. It let out a roar, a sound so primal it shook the air. Jake stumbled back, nearly falling. "Run!" I shouted, grabbing Elena's hand. We bolted for the cave's entrance, the creature's heavy footsteps echoing behind us. Its growls grew louder, closer, spurring us to move faster. The narrow tunnels seemed endless, and panic clawed at my chest. I glanced back once and wished I hadn't. The Guardian was gaining, its massive form filling the space. "Keep going!" Jake yelled, his voice tinged with terror. The light of the entrance came into view, a beacon of hope. With one final burst of energy, we burst out of the cave, tumbling onto the forest floor. For a moment, there was silence. Then the Guardian appeared at the cave's mouth. It didn't step outside, but stood there, its glowing eyes fixed on us. It let out one final roar before retreating into the darkness. We didn't stop running until we reached the main trail. Exhausted and shaken, we collapsed onto the ground. "What was that thing?" Eleanor asked, her voice trembling. None of us had an answer. We never reported the cave, fearing no one would believe us. It remains a secret, hidden deep in the forest, guarded by something ancient and terrifying. To this day, I can still hear its growl in my nightmares and see those burning eyes when I close mine. Whatever that Guardian was, it didn't want us there, and I pray no one else is foolish enough to disturb its domain. Growing up in a small Louisiana town meant the bayou was my backyard. The swamp held a strange beauty. Its tangled roots and glassy waters were both mesmerizing and ominous. Locals often told stories about the swamp's secrets, voodoo curses, phantom lights and cryptids that prowled its murky depths. I always thought those tales were just that, stories to spook kids into staying out of trouble. That changed one fateful summer evening. My best friend Lucas and I decided to head into the swamp to fish. It wasn't unusual for us. We'd grown up navigating its winding waterways. The air was thick with humidity, and the sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows over the water. We packed our gear into Lucas's old John boat and pushed off, the small outboard motor sputtering to life. "I heard something strange the other night," Lucas said as we drifted into the deeper parts of the swamp. "What kind of strange?" I asked, casting my line into the water. "Something big? Bigger than any gator?" I chuckled, shaking my head. "Probably just a hog or a bear. They wander down here sometimes." He didn't look convinced. This sounded wrong, like it wasn't supposed to be here. The swamp grew darker as we ventured further, the dense canopy above blocking out the last rays of sunlight. The sounds of crickets and frogs surrounded us, a constant hum of life. But as we neared a secluded cove, the noise abruptly stopped. "Did you hear that?" Lucas whispered, his voice barely audible. I nodded, uneasy. The swamp was never silent. We sat still, listening. Then faintly came the sound of whispering. It wasn't English nor any language I recognized. It was low, guttural, and seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Let's head back," I said, reeling in my line. Before Lucas could respond, the boat jolted violently, nearly tipping us over. He grabbed the edge, his eyes wide. "What the hell was that?" he hissed. "I don't know." Something moved in the water, a dark, massive shape gliding just beneath the surface. It circled the boat, ripples spreading outward in its wake. "Gator?" Lucas asked, though he didn't sound convinced. "Too big," I replied, my heart pounding. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to rise from the water itself, wrapping around us like a suffocating fog. Then from the shadows of the cove, a figure emerged. It was humanoid. But wrong. Its skin was slick and black, glistening like oil. Its limbs were elongated, its fingers ending in sharp, claw-like tips. Eyes like dull coals stared at us, devoid of life yet filled with malice. Neither of us moved. The creature let out a low, guttural growl, its body tensing as if ready to pounce. "Start the motor," I whispered to Lucas, barely able to speak through my terror. He fumbled with the engine, his hands shaking. The creature took a step, closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. "Hurry!" I urged, gripping my fishing knife with trembling hands. The motor roared to life and Lucas yanked the throttle. The boat surged forward, throwing up a spray of water. The creature let out a shriek, a sound so piercing and unnatural it made my ears ring. I glanced back to see it leaping into the water, its long limbs cutting through the surface as it gave chase. "Faster!" I shouted, but Lucas was already pushing the engine to its limits. The swamp blurred around us as we sped through the winding waterways. The creature was relentless, its dark form darting beneath the water and occasionally surfacing with a splash. We reached the main channel, the open water giving us a slight advantage. The creature slowed, its pursuit waning. It lingered at the edge of the cove, its coal-like eyes watching as we sped away. By the time we reached the dock, we were both shaking, our clothes soaked with sweat and swamp water. "What was that?" Lucas asked, his voice barely above, a whisper. "I don't know," I admitted, still clutching the fishing knife. We never went back to that part of the swamp. I told my uncle, a lifelong bayou resident, about what we'd seen. His face darkened and he simply said, "Some things out there aren't meant to be found." To this day, I can't shake the memory of those whispers or the creature's lifeless eyes. The swamp holds its secrets close, and I've learned to respect its boundaries. Whatever we encountered that night was a reminder that some legends are rooted in truth and some places are better left unexplored. Growing up in Appalachia meant embracing its rugged beauty, tight-knit communities, and old legends whispered around campfires. My hometown, Hemlock Ridge, was as remote as it was peaceful, but the woods surrounding it, they held a strange, unspoken menace. I'd heard stories of cryptid sightings, shadowy figures lurking among the trees, strange howls at night, and animals found mutilated in ways no predator could explain. I brushed off the tales as mountain folklore meant to keep kids from wandering too far. But one crisp October night, I learned how real those legends could be. It started with a call from my cousin, Beth. "You want to head up to Black Hollow tomorrow?" she asked, her voice crackling through the phone. "Black Hollow?" I repeated. The place was a dense patch of forest on the ridge's far side, avoided even by hunters. "Don't be a chicken, Nate," she teased. "I found some old maps Grandpa left behind. They show a cabin out there. Could be interesting, right?" Curiosity got the better of me, and I agreed. The next morning, we packed light. Water, snacks, flashlights, and Beth's old camping knife. We started early, the sun rising over, the ridge painting the world in warm hues. The trail to Black Hollow was overgrown, a narrow path snaking through thick underbrush. "You think anyone's been out here recently?" Beth asked, ducking under a low-hanging branch. "Doubt it," I replied. "This place is practically forgotten." As we ventured deeper, the air grew cooler, the light dimmer. The dense canopy overhead blocked out the sun, casting the forest in perpetual twilight. "It's quieter here," Beth remarked, pausing to listen. She was right. The usual sounds of the woods birds, insects, the rustle of leaves were absent. An uneasy feeling settled over me, but I kept walking. After what felt like hours, we stumbled upon the cabin. It was a weathered structure, its roof sagging and walls covered in moss. The windows were shattered, and the door hung crooked on its hinges. "Creepy," Beth said, pulling out her phone to take pictures. I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under my weight. The air smelled of damp wood and decay, rusted. Tools and broken furniture littered the room, but what caught my eye was a set of deep claw marks gouged into the walls. "Look at this," I called to Beth. She joined me, her eyes widening. "Bear, maybe," I said, though the marks seemed too deliberate, too precise. We explored further, finding little else of interest. As we prepared to leave, I noticed something odd, a stack of rocks arranged in a spiral near the cabin's edge. "Ever seen anything like this?" I asked Beth. She shook her head. "Nope, let's not stick around to find out." We began the trek back, but the unease from earlier had grown. The forest felt oppressive, the air heavy. Beth was unusually quiet, her usual chatter replaced by a tense silence. Then we heard Ita low, guttural growl. "What was that?" Beth whispered, her eyes darting around. "I don't know," I said, gripping my flashlight like a weapon. The growl came again, closer this time. Shadows shifted among the trees, and I caught a glimpse of something moving, something large and fast. "Run," I said, grabbing Beth's arm. We sprinted down the trail, branches clawing at our clothes. The growls grew louder, joined by the sound of heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush. I dared to look back and froze. A massive figure loomed behind us, its form obscured by shadow. It was humanoid, but hunched, with elongated limbs and glowing red eyes that pierced the darkness. Beth screamed, snapping me out of my stupor. We ran faster, the creature gaining ground. The trail twisted and turned, but it followed with unnatural ease. Ahead, I spotted a narrow crevice between two boulders. "In there!" I shouted, pulling Beth toward it. We squeezed through the gap, the rough stones scraping our skin. The creature stopped just short of the crevice, its red eyes glaring at us. It let out a bone-chilling howl, a sound that seemed to reverberate through the earth itself. For what felt like hours, we stayed hidden, the creature pacing just outside. Eventually it retreated, its heavy footsteps fading into the distance. We didn't wait to see if it would return. Emerging cautiously, we bolted down the trail, not stopping until we reached the edge of the forest. By the time we made it home, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over Hemlock Ridge. "What was that thing?" Beth asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I said, though the old stories of cryptids now felt uncomfortably real. We never went back to Black Hollow, and we never spoke of that day to anyone else. The forest keeps its secrets, and some things are better left undiscovered. But even now, when I close my eyes, I can see those glowing red eyes staring back at me. Reminder that there are creatures in this world that defy explanation. Elk Creek was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business. Nestled in a valley surrounded by thick forests and winding trails, it was quaint and peaceful, except for the stories. For decades, there had been rumors of a creature in the woods. Hunters would return empty-handed, their faces pale with fear. Livestock went missing without a trace, and every so often, someone claimed to see a hulking, shadowy figure lurking just beyond the tree line. I'd always chalked it up to folklore until the night I encountered it myself. It started on a cold November evening. My friend Caleb and I had planned a camping trip near the old mill, about 5 miles from town. Caleb was a survivalist at heart, always itching for an adventure, while I preferred the comforts of home, but he had a way of convincing me to tag along. "Come on, Jack," he'd said earlier that week. "We'll catch some trout, light a fire, and just unwind. No Wi-Fi, no work, just nature." Reluctantly, I agreed. We arrived at the campsite just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sky was a brilliant blend of orange and purple, the kind of view that made you forget the cold creeping in. We set up our tent, gathered firewood, and settled in for the night. "Think we'll see the Elk Creek beast?" Caleb joked as he skewered a fish over the fire. "Not you too," I groaned. "That's just a story to scare kids." He smirked. "You never know. The woods are deep, and people don't come back with those stories for nothing." We ate in companionable silence, the crackling fire the only sound. The forest around us seemed unnaturally quiet, as if the animals had all decided to steer clear of our little camp. "Do you hear that?" Caleb asked suddenly, his head tilting. "Hear what?" "Exactly." It took me a moment to understand. There was no wind rustling the leaves, no hoot of an owl, not even the chirp of a cricket. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. "Probably just the weather," I said, though unease prickled at the back of my neck. As the fire died down, we retreated to the tent. Caleb fell asleep almost instantly, but I lay awake, staring at the canvas above me. The silence outside was oppressive, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig. Around midnight, I heard a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground. "Caleb," I whispered, shaking his shoulder. He stirred, groggy. "What?" "Listen." The growl came again, closer this time. Caleb sat up, his eyes wide. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know." We grabbed our flashlights and stepped outside. The fire had completely burned out, leaving the camp in darkness. The moon provided some light, but the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally far. Then we saw it. A massive figure stood at the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by the trees. It was easily 7 feet tall, with broad shoulders and limbs that didn't move like they should. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, piercing through the darkness. "Holy!" Caleb started, but the creature let out a roar that froze the words in his throat. We bolted. Grabbing only what we could carry, we sprinted toward the trail leading back to town. The creature crashed through the forest behind us, its footsteps thunderous and relentless. "Don't look back!" Caleb shouted, though I could hear the terror in his voice. Branches whipped at our faces, and the uneven ground threatened to trip us with every step. The creature's growls grew louder, as if it were toying with us, letting us think we had a chance. Finally, we broke. Through the tree line and onto the main road. A car's headlights appeared in the distance, and we flagged it down frantically. The driver, an older man named Bill, pulled over, his face a mix of confusion and concern. "What the hell happened to you two?" "There's something in the woods," Caleb panted, leaning against the car for support. Bill's expression darkened. "Get in. Now." We didn't need to be told twice. As Bill drove us back to town, he glanced in the rearview mirror. "You boys are lucky. That thing's been around for years. Took my brother back in '87. No one believed me." "What is it?" I asked, my voice trembling. Bill shook his head. "Don't know, but it's not something you want to see twice." We arrived at Caleb's house, where his family fussed over us, demanding to know what happened. We gave them a vague explanation, leaving out the creature. That night I lay awake, haunted by the glowing yellow eyes and the sound of its roar. The following morning, Caleb and I swore never to return to the woods near Elk Creek. Whatever lurks, out there it's not meant to be found, and it's certainly not meant to be challenged. Some mysteries, I've learned, are best left unsolved. Hollow Ridge was a place everyone in town knew about, but few dared to visit. It sat at the edge of Maple County, shrouded in dense woods and cloaked in unsettling stories. People whispered about strange sightings, a tall, shadowy figure that stalked, the unwary, eyes gleaming like embers in the dark. As a kid, I always dismissed the tales as pure exaggeration. That changed the summer I turned 21. My cousin Alex and I were known for our mutual love of hiking and photography. He had a knack for finding hidden trails and off-the-map places, and I was always game to follow. One weekend, he proposed we explore Hollow Ridge, a suggestion that made even his adventurous spirit seem reckless. "Alex, you know the stories about that place," I said, laughing nervously as we packed our gear. "And that's exactly why we should go," he replied with a grin. "It'll be one for the books, man. Think about the photos we could get." Against my better judgment, I agreed. Early Saturday morning, we loaded up his Jeep and made the hour-long drive to the base of the ridge. The closer we got, the quieter the surrounding area became, as though nature itself was holding its breath. We parked by an old, rusted gate with a faded sign that read, "No entry." Typical Alex, he saw this as an invitation. With our backpacks secured, we slipped past the gate and began the climb. The first couple of hours were uneventful. The trail, though overgrown, wound through a canopy of trees that filtered sunlight in scattered patches. Birds chirped above, and the air was crisp and fresh. It was almost serene until we reached the plateau. The atmosphere changed abruptly. The air felt heavier, the trees stood unnaturally still, and the sounds of wildlife disappeared. It was as if we had crossed an invisible threshold into another world. "Creepy," Alex muttered, snapping a photo of the unsettling stillness. "Maybe we should head back," I suggested, unease prickling my skin. "Come on, we've made it this far. Let's see what's ahead." Reluctantly, I followed him further into the ridge. That's when we found the clearing. In the middle of the space stood an ancient stone structure, like a weathered altar surrounded by charred earth. Symbols I couldn't recognize were etched into the stone, their grooves filled with something dark and viscous. The sight sent a shiver down my spine. "What do you think this is?" Alex whispered, his voice unusually subdued. "Nothing good," I replied. "We should go." But Alex, ever the thrill-seeker, approached the altar with his camera. As he took a picture, a low, guttural growl echoed from the trees. We froze. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. "Yeah," Alex replied, his eyes darting around the clearing. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps crunching through the underbrush. My heart raced as I scanned the tree line, searching for the source. Then I saw it. A massive, shadowy figure stepped into view. It was easily 8 feet tall, its limbs unnaturally long, and its eyes burned with a fiery red glow. Its form flickered, as though it didn't fully belong to this world. "Run!" Alex breathed, his voice trembling. We bolted, abandoning the trail and crashing through the forest in a blind panic. The creature pursued us, its growls shaking the very ground beneath our feet. Branches snagged at our clothes, and the uneven terrain threatened to trip us with every step. Somehow, we made it back to the rusted gate. The creature stopped at the edge of the woods, its glowing eyes fixed on us as we stumbled to the Jeep. Alex fumbled with the keys, and I yelled for him to hurry. As the engine roared to life, I looked back one last time. The creature raised its head and let out an ear-splitting howl that echoed through the valley. Then it retreated into the shadows, vanishing as suddenly as it had appeared. We didn't speak the entire drive home. When we finally reached my house, Alex turned to me, his face pale. "We're never going back there," he said firmly. I nodded, too shaken to argue. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those burning red eyes staring back at me. Hollow Ridge had always been a mystery, but now I understood why it was left alone. Some places weren't meant to be explored, and some stories weren't meant to be proven true. They came from everywhere and nowhere, disembodied voices that filled the air with a chilling chant. The beast turned its head sharply, its ears twitching. It let out one final growl before retreating into the shadows. Ethan and I didn't wait to see what would happen next. We ran until we reached the trailhead, and didn't stop until we were safely inside his car. Neither of us spoke during the drive home, our minds too consumed with what we had just witnessed. To this day, I don't know what we encountered at Shadow Creek. Was it the beast? A cryptid born of local legend? Or something far worse? All I know is that we weren't alone that night, and the forest was far darker than we had ever imagined. Shadow Creek was the kind of place you only visited if you were hopelessly lost or terribly curious. For years, it had been the epicenter of local Lauria small streams surrounded by dense woods that seemed darker than any other place in the county. The stories ranged from the fantastical to the downright terrifying. Lights floating above the water, whispers carried on the wind, and, most notoriously, a creature people only referred to as the Beast. I never believed in any of it, not until my brother Ethan and I decided to camp there one fateful weekend. Ethan, always the skeptic, thought the stories were a joke. I, on the other hand, was intrigued but cautious. I had heard too many accounts, from hunters and hikers who had returned pale-faced, mumbling about something watching them from the trees. We packed lightly, tents, a couple of flashlights, some food, and of course, Ethan's trusty camera. "If there's anything out there, I'm getting it on film," he said with a grin. The hike to Shadow Creek was uneventful at first. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves absent. It was as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. By the time we reached the creek, the sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long, twisted shadows over the landscape. We set up camp on a flat patch of ground near the water. The creek's surface glimmered faintly in the fading light, and a cold breeze swept through the trees, making me shiver. "This isn't so bad," Ethan said, pulling out his camera. "Pretty scenic, actually." I nodded, but unease coiled in my stomach. The air felt charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm, and the forest seemed too still, too watchful. As night fell, the quiet became oppressive. The crackling of our small fire was the only sound, its light casting flickering shapes against the trees. We talked about mundane things to pass the time, trying to ignore the creeping sense of dread. Then, around midnight, it began. A low growl echoed through the woods. It was deep and guttural, unlike anything I had ever heard. Ethan and I froze, our conversation dying mid-sentence. "Probably just a coyote," Ethan whispered, though his voice lacked conviction. I shook my head. "That didn't sound like a coyote!" The growl came again, closer this time. The firelight seemed to shrink as the darkness pressed in around us. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the trees, but the beam was swallowed by the night. "Maybe we should leave," I said, my voice trembling. Ethan laughed nervously. "Come on, we just got here. It's probably nothing." But the next sound erased any doubts. A heavy thud, followed by the crunch of leaves and snapping branches, came from the edge of the clearing. Whatever was out there was big. Too big. We both stood, our eyes fixed on the darkness. The creature stepped into the firelight, and my breath caught in my throat. It was massive, standing on two legs but hunched over like a predator ready to pounce. Its fur was matted and dark, its face a horrifying blend of wolf and man. Glowing yellow eyes bored into us, filled with an intelligence that was as unsettling as its monstrous form. "Run," Ethan whispered. We didn't need to be told twice. We bolted into the woods, the creature's guttural growl chasing us. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees twisting and bending in the shadows. The beast's footsteps were heavy and relentless, growing louder with every passing second. Ethan tripped, and I skidded to a stop to help him. The creature was closing in, its yellow eyes cutting through the darkness like headlights. I grabbed Ethan's arm, pulling him to his feet, and we sprinted toward the creek. We reached the water, our lungs burning and legs shaking. The beast stood on the opposite bank, its form illuminated by the pale light of the moon. It let out a deafening roar that seemed to shake the very ground beneath our feet. Without thinking, I grabbed a rock and hurled it at the creature. It hit its mark, striking the beast's shoulder. It snarled but didn't move, its gaze locked on us as if daring us to try escaping. Then the whispers began. The whispers. I grew up in a small town surrounded by dense woods, a place where folklore and whispered tales were as much a part of life as the changing seasons. Of all the stories passed around, one stood out, the tale of the hollow pines cryptid. People spoke of a creature that prowled the forest, something neither man nor beast, with glowing red eyes that pierced the night. Most locals dismissed it as a myth, but a few swore they had seen it or something like it lurking just beyond the tree line. I wasn't a believer, at least not at first. That changed when my best friend Caleb disappeared. It happened during one of our weekend outings. Caleb and I had always been adventurous, spending our Saturdays hiking through the woods or fishing at the old creek. That day, he convinced me to explore deeper into hollow pines than we ever had before. "You scared, Danny?" he teased, flashing a grin as he adjusted his backpack. "Not scared," I shot back, "just not eager to get lost." The woods felt different as we ventured further in, quieter, heavier, as if the trees were pressing in on us. The sunlight struggled to penetrate the canopy, casting the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. Caleb, undeterred, led the way, cutting through the underbrush with an energy I envied. After hours of trekking, we stumbled upon something unexpected, a clearing with an old, dilapidated cabin at its center. It looked like it had been abandoned for decades, its roof sagging and windows boarded up. Vines crept up its sides, and the air around it felt colder, heavier. "Let's check it out," Caleb said, his eyes alight with curiosity. I hesitated. Maybe we shouldn't. "Oh, come on. What's the worst that could happen?" Reluctantly, I followed him. The cabin's door creaked ominously as Caleb pushed it open, revealing a dark interior that smelled of damp wood and decay. The floorboards groaned under our weight as we stepped inside. The space was empty except for a few rusted tools and a tattered chair, but it felt wrong, like we were intruding. That's when we heard it. A low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the very walls. Caleb froze, his face paling. "Did you hear that?" I nodded, my heart pounding. "We need to leave, now." But before we could move, the growl came again, this time followed by the sound of heavy footsteps outside. Something massive was circling the cabin, its presence undeniable. The windows rattled as it brushed past, and I caught a glimpse of those glowing red eyes through the gaps in the boards. "Stay quiet," I whispered, grabbing Caleb's arm. We huddled in the corner, barely breathing, as the creature prowled outside. The footsteps paused near the door, and for a horrifying moment, I thought it would come in. But then it moved on, disappearing into the forest. We didn't wait to see if it would return. Caleb and I bolted from the cabin, running as fast as our legs could carry us. The woods seemed alive with sound, branches snapping, leaves rustling, and that unearthly growl echoing all around us. I didn't dare look back. After what felt like hours, we stumbled into a clearing and collapsed, gasping for air. "What the hell was that?" Caleb panted, his face slick with sweat. I don't know, I admitted, my voice shaking. But we're not going back. We made our way home in silence, the weight of what we had experienced settling over us. For weeks I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and Caleb became unusually withdrawn. He stopped talking about the woods, stopped suggesting our weekend adventures. Then one night, he disappeared. The search parties combed through hollow pines, but found no trace of him. I told the authorities about the cabin and the creature we had encountered, but they dismissed it as nonsense, chalking Caleb's disappearance up to an animal attack or a tragic accident. I knew better. Haunted by guilt and a desperate need for answers, I returned to the forest alone. The woods felt even more oppressive without Caleb by my side, the silence deafening. It took hours to find the cabin again, and when I did, I almost turned back. But something drove me forward, a mix of fear and determination. The cabin was as I remembered it, but the air around it felt darker, heavier. I stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the gloom. That's when I saw it, a crude drawing carved into one of the walls. It depicted a figure tall, hunched, with glowing red eyes. Beside it was a single word: run. Before I could process what I was seeing, the growl returned, louder and more menacing than before. The creature was back, and this time I knew it wouldn't let me leave. I ran, my flashlight bobbing wildly as I sprinted through the woods. The creature's footsteps thundered behind me, closer and closer. Branches clawed at my skin, and my lungs burned with the effort, but I didn't stop. Somehow, I made it back to the edge of the forest and collapsed onto the road. To this day, Caleb has never been found, and I haven't set foot in Hollow Pines since. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the growl in my dreams, or worse, just outside my window. Growing up in a rural town nestled between rolling hills and dense woodlands, Devil's Hollow was a name that carried an almost sacred weight. It was a stretch of untamed wilderness at the edge of town, avoided by locals and whispered about. In hushed tones, legends of strange occurrences and monstrous sightings had been passed down for generations. To us kids, Devil's Hollow was a source of equal parts fascination and dread. When I turned 19, my friends and I thought we were invincible, the kind who laughed in the face of danger. Mike, with his reckless charm, had the brilliant idea to camp in Devil's Hollow one summer night. "Come on, Liam," he said, his grin wide and persuasive. "Think of the stories we'll have after this." I hesitated, but eventually caved. Our group of four, Mike, his girlfriend Jenny, her younger brother Sam, and me packed our gear and set off for what we thought would be a thrilling adventure. The entrance to Devil's Hollow was unassuming, marked by an old wooden sign hanging crookedly from rusted chains. As we ventured deeper, the forest seemed to close in around us. The air grew cooler, and an unnatural stillness settled over the woods. It was as if the place was holding its breath. We set up camp in a small clearing and built a fire. Laughter and the smell of roasting marshmallows filled the air as the sun dipped below the horizon. But as darkness fell, the atmosphere shifted. The night was unnervingly silent, no crickets, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive quiet broken only by the crackling fire. Around midnight, Mike decided to test the limits of our courage. "Let's explore," he said, grabbing his flashlight. Jenny rolled her eyes. "Mike, it's pitch black out there. Let's just stay here." "Don't be a buzzkill," he retorted, already heading toward the tree line. Against my better judgment, I followed, and soon the others reluctantly joined. The deeper we went, the more the forest seemed alive in a way I couldn't explain. Shadows danced in our flashlight. Beams and the trees appeared almost sentient, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Then we heard a low, guttural growl that made my blood run cold. "What was that?" Sam whispered, his voice trembling. "Probably just an animal," Mike said, though his bravado had clearly waned. The growl came again, closer this time. Panic set in, and we decided to head back to camp, but the path we had taken seemed to have vanished. The woods around us felt unfamiliar, disorienting, as if they had shifted while we weren't looking. "Stay together," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We'll find our way back." We walked in tense silence, the growl occasionally echoing through the trees. Then came the snapping of branches, heavy footsteps, and the unmistakable sense of being hunted. Jenny screamed as a pair of glowing yellow eyes appeared in the darkness, unblinking and predatory. The creature stepped into the dim light of our flashlights, and what I saw defied explanation. It stood over 7 feet tall, its body covered in coarse black fur. Its limbs were grotesquely elongated, and its face was a horrifying blend of wolf and man with a snout full of razor-sharp teeth. "Run!" Mike shouted, and we scattered, each of us fleeing blindly into the night. I don't remember how long I ran, only that the terror in my chest outweighed the burning in my lungs. The creature's growls echoed all around, and the woods seemed to conspire against me, tripping me up with roots and low-hanging branches. I eventually stumbled into a small cave and crouched inside, my heart hammering in my chest. For what felt like hours, I sat in the darkness, listening to the creature's guttural snarls as it prowled outside. At one point, its shadow filled the cave's entrance, and I held my breath, praying it wouldn't find me. Finally, the growls faded, and the forest fell silent once more. When I emerged at dawn, the forest seemed almost serene, as if the horrors of the night had been nothing but a bad dream. But when I returned to the clearing, our campsite was destroyed, tents shredded, gear scattered, and no sign of my friends. A search party was organized, and the authorities combed through Devil's Hollow for days. They found nothing, no evidence of my friends or the creature that had hunted us. The official report chalked it up to a tragic accident, but I knew the truth. Years have passed, and I've never returned to Devil's Hollow. The guilt of leaving my friends behind haunts me, but so does the knowledge of what lurks in those woods. Sometimes, late at night, I hear that growl again, and I wonder if the creature is still out there, waiting for its next victims. There's a stretch of road that cuts through hollow pines, a dense and ominous forest just outside of a small Midwest town. Truckers avoid it at night, and locals share whispered warnings about strange happenings. Growing up near hollow pines, I never gave the tales much thought until I had my own encounter with what dwells there. It began on a chilly October evening. I was driving back from visiting my sister, taking the back roads to avoid the interstate traffic. My car was a reliable old sedan, but even reliable machines have their quirks. That night, it decided to stall in the worst possible place right in the heart of hollow pines. I sighed in frustration and turned the key, but the engine refused to start. The forest around me was eerily silent, save for the occasional rustling of leaves. The sinking sun cast long shadows across the road, making the woods look like a painting come to life, one where the artist had only shades of black and grey. I checked my phone, hoping to call for help, but there was no signal. Cursing under my breath, I grabbed a flashlight from the glove box and stepped out of the car. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of moss and decaying wood. I figured I'd walk to the nearest gas station, which I remembered passing a few miles back. As I began my trek, the unease settled in like an unwelcome passenger. The forest felt alive, not in the wholesome, vibrant way nature usually does, but in a way that made my skin crawl. It was the kind of alive that watches you, follows your every step. About half a mile down the road, I heard it for the first times. Long, mournful howl that sent chills racing down my spine. It was unlike any animal sound I had ever heard. It wasn't a wolf, not quite, but it wasn't human either. It carried a depth, a resonance that seemed to vibrate through the trees themselves. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand. My rational mind told me it was just a coyote or some other wild animal, but every instinct screamed at me to run. Against better judgment, I pressed on, quickening my pace as the howls grew louder and more frequent. Then the rustling began. It wasn't the gentle sound of wind in the trees, but something deliberate, purposeful. Twigs snapped, leaves crunched, and whatever it was following me. I shone the flashlight into the woods, but the beam only illuminated the dense undergrowth and gnarled branches. Still I felt its presence, just out of sight, just beyond the edge of the light. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. "Is someone there?" The howling stopped abruptly, and the silence was deafening. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, and I could swear I heard breathing, deep, guttural, and far too close. Panic overtook me, and I broke into a run. The flashlight bobbed wildly in my hand, casting erratic beams that only heightened my fear. I stumbled over roots and rocks, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. The sound of heavy footsteps followed, faster and more determined than my own. I didn't dare look back. The road felt endless, and my legs burned with exertion. Just when I thought I couldn't go any farther, I saw a flicker of light through the trees. A gas station. The sight gave me a surge of adrenaline, and I sprinted the last stretch, practically throwing myself through the door. The clerk, a wiry man with glasses and a bemused expression, looked up from his magazine. "You okay there, buddy?" he asked, clearly unprepared for the frantic mess I had become. "There's something out there," I stammered, pointing toward the forest. He raised an eyebrow and glanced out the window. "You mean hollow pines?" He chuckled, but it was a nervous laugh, not one of disbelief. "Yeah, weird things happen out there, but I've never seen anything myself." "I'm telling you, something's out there," I insisted. It was chasing me. He nodded slowly and handed me a bottle of water. "Why don't you sit for a bit and catch your breath?" I sat down at one of the small tables near the window, still trembling. The clerk locked the door and pulled the blinds, muttering something about "just in case." His reaction unsettled me more than anything, else he believed me, or at least enough to take precautions. After what felt like an eternity, I mustered the courage to peek outside. The forest loomed dark and impenetrable, but nothing moved. The clerk offered to drive me back to my car in his old pickup truck, and I reluctantly agreed. The ride was tense. We didn't speak, and the truck's headlights barely penetrated the oppressive darkness. When we reached my car, it was untouched, but deep claw marks scored the road nearby, as if something massive had passed through. The clerk swore under his breath and refused to get out of the truck. I didn't blame him. I managed to get my car started miraculously and drove home without stopping. That night I barely slept. The howls haunted my dreams, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something far worse than a stranded car in the woods. To this day, I avoid hollow pines. The locals may laugh off the legends, but I know the truth. There's something in those woods, something that shouldn't exist. And if you ever find yourself on that lonely road, pray your car doesn't stall. I had heard the stories of Silver Creek since I was a child. Nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, the small, forgotten town carried whispers of strange happenings, vanished hikers, unexplainable shadows, and animals that didn't quite seem right. My grandmother used to tell me that the forest near Silver Creek was cursed, inhabited by spirits who could take any form. As a kid, I dismissed her tales as folklore meant to keep me from wandering too far. But years later, when I found myself stranded there, those stories came rushing back with chilling clarity. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip. My best friend Logan and I were college seniors, looking for one last adventure before life dragged us into the real world. Logan was the bold one, the kind of guy who scoffed at danger. I, on the other hand, was the cautious type, the one who double-checked the tent poles and packed extra batteries for the flashlight. We arrived at Silver Creek on a crisp autumn afternoon. The air was thick with the scent of pine and decaying leaves, the sunlight filtering through the canopy in golden shafts. It was beautiful, but unnervingly quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. We set up camp near the creek, a shimmering ribbon of water that wound through the dense woods. By nightfall we had a fire roaring, and the world seemed to shrink to the circle of light around us. Logan regaled me with stories of his childhood misadventures while I roasted marshmallows, trying to ignore the gnawing unease in my gut. Around midnight, the first sign of trouble came. A distant howl, low and mournful, echoed through the trees. "That's just a coyote," Logan said, tossing another log on the fire. But I wasn't so sure. The sound was deeper, almost guttural, and carried a strange cadence that sent a shiver down my spine. We both fell silent, listening. The howls came again, closer this time. Then, an unsettling rustling in the underbrush. "Probably just a deer," Logan muttered, though his voice lacked its usual bravado. "Deer don't sound like that," I whispered. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows on the other side of the fire. At first, I thought it was a mantle and lean, with long limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. But as it stepped into the flickering light, I realized with growing horror that it wasn't a man at all. Its face was almost human, but its eyes were pitch black, void of any emotion or life. Its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, revealing rows of sharp teeth. "Logan!" I barely managed to breathe his name. The thing stared at us for what felt like an eternity before it mimicked Logan's voice perfectly. Probably just a "Deer!" We bolted. We didn't even bother packing up the campsite. Grabbing only our flashlights and phones, we ran blindly through the woods, the creature's laughter a perfect imitation of Logan's echoing behind us. Branches whipped at my face, and roots threatened to trip me at every step, but adrenaline pushed me forward. Logan was ahead of me, shouting directions that made no sense in the chaotic darkness. Suddenly, the ground beneath me gave way, and I tumbled into a shallow ravine. Pain shot through my ankle, but I scrambled to my feet, desperate to keep moving. Logan was gone, his flashlight beam no longer visible through the trees. "Logan!" I screamed, my voice hoarse with panic. The forest answered with silence. I limped forward, every rustle and crack of a twig making my heart pound. Then I heard it, Logan's voice, calling my name. "Over here, man!" he shouted. Relief flooded me, and I followed the sound, ignoring the searing pain in my ankle. But as I drew closer, something felt off. Logan's voice was coming from multiple directions, each one slightly different. "Over here, man! Over here, man!" The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. It was the creature mimicking him. I turned and ran in the opposite direction, tears streaming down my face. The thing's laughter followed me, its voice shifting between Logan's and my own. Finally, I stumbled upon an old cabin, its wooden frame barely standing. With no other options, I forced the door open and collapsed inside, barricading it with a rotting table. The cabin smelled of mildew and decay, but it was better than the alternative. Hours passed. The creature circled the cabin, scratching at the walls and whispering in Logan's voice. "Let me in, man. It's me. It's safe now." I didn't respond, clutching my flashlight like a lifeline. At dawn, the sounds stopped. I waited until the sun was fully up before peeking outside. The forest was silent, the ground littered with claw marks. I limped back to the campsite, hoping against hope that Logan had made it out. The site was destroyed, a tent shredded, our belongings scattered. But Logan was nowhere to be found. Search parties combed the area for weeks, but they never found any trace of him. I told the authorities what happened, but they chalked it up to trauma and an overactive imagination. I know what I saw, and I know that whatever took Logan is still out there, waiting for its next victim. If you ever find yourself near Silver Creek, heed the warnings. The stories are real and the forest doesn't forget. I never believed in the supernatural, not until the summer of 2019. That year, I worked as a ranger at Blackwood Lake National Park, a vast expanse of forest and waterways nestled in the heart of the Midwest. It was a dream job for someone like me, a lover of the outdoors who found peace in the solitude of nature. But peace is the last thing I associate with that summer now. It started with a missing persons report. A local family had gone camping by the lake and failed to return home. Their car was still parked at the trailhead, but there was no sign of them anywhere. Search parties were organized, and as one of the rangers, I was tasked with combing the woods. The search was unsettling from the start. The forest seemed wrong. Birds were unusually quiet, their songs replaced by an oppressive stillness. My co-workers dismissed it as my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. After days of searching, we found the family's campsite, or what was left of it. Their tent was shredded, supplies scattered, and there were strange, deep gouges in the trees surrounding the area. It looked like an animal attack, but there were no tracks, no blood, no signs of struggle. The family was never found. A few weeks later, reports started coming in from hikers and campers. They spoke of an enormous figure lurking in the woods, moving too quickly and silently to be human. Some claimed it had glowing eyes, others described it as a shadow with no discernible features. My boss brushed off these accounts, blaming overactive imaginations or nighttime hallucinations. But then I saw it. It was a quiet evening, and I was patrolling the northern trails near dusk. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the forest floor. As I rounded a bend, I caught sight of something massive moving between the trees. It was tall, easily over 7 feet, and covered in dark, matted fur. At first, I thought it was a bear, but the way it moved was wrong. It was too upright, too deliberate. I froze, my hand instinctively going to the radio on my belt. But as I fumbled with the device, the creature turned toward me. Its eyes were the first thing I noticed. They were a sickly yellow, glowing faintly in the dim light. Its face was elongated, somewhere between a wolf and a man, with a snout full of sharp, uneven teeth. For what felt like an eternity, we just stared at each other. Then it let out a low, guttural growl that vibrated in my chest. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the ranger station, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I told my co-workers what I'd seen, but they laughed it off, accusing me of letting the missing family case get to my head. But I knew what I saw. The following weeks were a blur of sleepless nights and mounting dread. The creature, whatever it was, seemed to grow bolder. Campers continued to report sightings, and some even claimed it followed them, staying just out of sight, but close enough to be felt. Then came the night it attacked. I was on overnight duty, manning the station alone. The woods were dark and quiet, the only sound the occasional chirp of crickets. Around midnight, the power went out. Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped outside to check the generator. The air was unnervingly still, and a thick fog had settled over the area, muffling every sound. As I rounded the corner of the building, I heard utter, deep, guttural breathing that sent a chill down my spine. Slowly, I turned the flashlight toward the sound. It was there, standing just 20 feet away. Its fur was matted with mud, and its yellow eyes glowed like embers in the dark. For a moment, I was too terrified to move. Then it let out a deafening roar and charged. I dove back into the station, slamming the door shut and bolting it. The creature hit the door with enough force to rattle the entire building. It clawed at the wood, its growls vibrating through the walls. I grabbed the shotgun we kept for emergencies and fired through the door. The creature let out an ear-piercing screech and retreated into the woods. When the other rangers arrived the next morning, they found the door shredded and deep gouges in the floorboards. I was shaken, but alive. The incident was brushed off as a bear attack, but I knew better. I quit the job the next day and moved as far from Blackwood Lake as I could. To this day, I don't know what that creature was, but I do know one thing: it's still out there, waiting for the next poor soul to wander too deep into its territory. If you ever visit Blackwood Lake, be careful. The forest is beautiful, but it has its secrets, and not all of them want to stay hidden. Growing up, I'd always heard the legends about Shadow Creek, the narrow river winding through the dense woods near my hometown. Locals spoke in hushed tones about a creature that roamed the area, towering, half-man, half-beast, with glowing red eyes and an unrelenting hunger. My parents dismissed it as folklore designed to keep children from wandering too far into the wilderness. But curiosity has a way of leading you places you should never go. It was the summer after I graduated high school, and my friends and I decided to spend a weekend camping near Shadow Creek. We were a group of 6, me, my best friend Jake, his girlfriend Lisa, and 3 others, Mark, Tina, and Sarah. None of us believed in the stories, but they added a thrill to the trip. The first day was uneventful. We hiked, fished, and set up camp a few yards from the creek. The air was warm, the woods alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. As night fell, we lit a campfire, sharing ghost stories and laughing at each other's exaggerated tales. But as the fire dwindled and the night deepened, the mood shifted. The forest, once full of life, fell unnervingly silent. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive quiet that seemed to swallow every sound. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes darting toward the trees. We all paused, straining to hear. At first, there was nothing. Then, a low, guttural growl echoed through the darkness. Jake laughed nervously. "It's probably just a coyote or something." But the growl came again, louder this time and closer. We grabbed flashlights and shone them into the woods, the beams cutting through the darkness. The shadows between the trees seemed to move, shifting unnaturally as if something massive was lurking just out of sight. "Let's all just calm down," Mark said, though his voice wavered. "We're probably freaking ourselves out over
nothing." None of us believed him. The growl turned into a series of heavy, deliberate footsteps.
whatever it was circling us, staying just beyond the reach of our flashlights. "Everyone, into the tents," I whispered urgently. We scrambled into the 2 tents, zipping them shut and huddling together in silence. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the snapping of branches and an occasional guttural snarl. Then the unthinkable happened. Our tent mine, Jake's and Lisa's, was yanked violently to the side, the fabric tearing as we were dragged several feet. Screams erupted from the other tent as Sarah and Tina shouted for Mark, who was outside trying to fight whatever had grabbed
us. Jake unzipped the tent just enough to peek out, only to reel back in terror. "It's huge," he gasped. "It's not an animal, it's..." Before he could finish, the tent was ripped open. Standing before us was the thing of nightmares.
It stood nearly 8 feet tall, its body covered in thick, dark fur. Its face was grotesquely wolf-like, but with a twisted, almost human expression. Its eyes glowed red, burning with an unnatural light, and its claws gleamed in the moonlight. It let out a deafening roar, sending us scrambling out of the tent and into the woods. I could hear the others yelling somewhere behind me, but all I could focus on was running, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. I didn't stop until I reached the creek. My lungs burned, my legs felt like lead, but I couldn't stop. I turned to look behind me, and there it was, stalking toward me on all fours, its movements unnervingly fluid for something so massive. Desperate, I grabbed a fallen branch and swung it as hard as I could when it lunged at me. The branch shattered against its arm, but the creature recoiled, letting out a guttural snarl. Out of nowhere, Mark appeared, brandishing a flare gun he'd grabbed from the supplies. He fired, and the bright red light shot into the creature's chest. It howled in pain, retreating into the shadows of the forest. We regrouped at the campsite, shaken but alive. Tina and Sarah were crying. Jake's face was pale, and Mark was clutching the flare gun like a lifeline. "We need to leave," Lisa said, her voice trembling. "Now!" We packed up as quickly as we could, leaving behind anything that wouldn't fit into our arms. The hike back to the cars was a blur of fear and adrenaline, every sound in the forest sending us into a panic. When we finally reached the parking lot, the sun was rising, casting an eerie light over the woods. We piled into the cars and drove away, not stopping until we were miles from Shadow Creek. We never spoke of that night again, but sometimes, late at night, I dream of those glowing red eyes and the low growl that preceded its attack. I don't know what we encountered that night, but I do know one thing. The legends of Shadow Creek aren't just stories. If you ever venture into those woods, keep your wits about you. And if the forest goes silent, run. It all began with a dare. Small towns have a way of birthing strange legends, and Hollow Pines was no exception. Situated on the edge of the Appalachians, the town was steeped in folklore. The most infamous tale was of a creature that stalked the dense woods at night, a dogman, some said, a beast of unearthly proportions. The elders called it the Guardian, though no one could explain what it guarded or why. I didn't believe any of it. At 22, I was a city girl visiting my cousin Paige for the summer. She lived on the outskirts of Hollow Pines, her home bordering the vast forest. Life there was slow, the people friendly, but deeply superstitious. To me, it was charming, even quaint. That was, until the night Paige and her boyfriend Will dared me to go into the woods alone. "You're not scared, are you?" Paige teased, her grin illuminated by the flickering firelight. "Of course not," I shot back, feigning confidence. "It's just a silly story." Will leaned in, his expression serious. "It's not a story. People go missing out there." I laughed, but his words stuck with me. Still, I wasn't about to back down. Armed with a flashlight and a knife, Will insisted I carry. I stepped into the forest. The trees closed in around me, their towering forms blocking out the moonlight. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. I walked for what felt like an eternity, my flashlight cutting a narrow path through the darkness. At first, it was peaceful. The rhythmic chirping of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves filled the air. But then the forest grew unnaturally silent. It was as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. I stopped, scanning my surroundings. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. Something was watching me. I could feel it. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The only response was a low growl, deep and guttural, echoing through the trees. My heart raced as I swung the flashlight around, the beams slicing through the shadows. That's when I saw them, two glowing yellow eyes staring at me from the underbrush. The creature stepped into the light, and I froze. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, with a muscular frame covered in coarse, dark fur. Its face was wolf-like, but its stance was unnervingly human. It bared its teeth, a growl rumbling from deep within its chest. Instinct took over, and I ran. My feet pounded against the forest floor as branches whipped at my face and arms. The beast was close, its heavy footsteps closing the distance. I could hear its labored breathing, feel its presence bearing down on me. I tripped over a root and fell hard, the flashlight flying from my hand. Pain shot through my ankle, but there was no time to dwell on it. The creature loomed above me, its eyes glowing like molten gold. I grabbed the knife and swung wildly, the blade connecting with its arm. It howled in pain, the sound piercing and inhuman. To my shock, the beast didn't retaliate. It backed away, its eyes locked on mine as if studying me. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then it turned and disappeared into the shadows. I lay there, trembling, my mind racing. What had just happened? Why hadn't it killed me? I stumbled back to the house, my ankle throbbing with every step. Paige and Will were waiting, their faces pale with worry. "What happened?" Paige asked, rushing to my side. I told them everything, my words tumbling out in a frantic rush. Will's expression darkened. "You're lucky," he said. "Most people who see it don't come back." The next day, I decided to leave Hollow Pines, but as I packed, I couldn't shake the feeling that the creature had spared me for a reason. There was something in its eyes, something almost human. To this day, I don't know what I encountered in those woods. Was it truly the guardian of Hollow Pines, or was it something far older, far more mysterious? Whatever it was, it left me with a deep respect for the wilderness and its secrets. If you ever find yourself near Hollow Pines, remember this: the forest is alive and it remembers. Be cautious, be respectful, and above all, be ready. You never know what might be watching, what might. Blackthorn Hollow was a forgotten town, nestled in a valley so remote it didn't appear on most maps. The stories surrounding it were whispered in hushed tones in nearby towns. They spoke of an ancient guardian, a cryptid that stalked the dense woods surrounding Blackthorn, half-man, half-wolfer dogman. To the locals, it wasn't just a legend, it was a warning. I'd heard the stories growing up. My father, a truck driver, often passed through the region. He spoke of the town as if it were cursed, a place where strange things happened. When he disappeared on a routine delivery 5 years ago, I couldn't help but think Blackthorn Hollow held the answers. Now, as a journalist with a knack for unraveling urban legends, I had a reason to visit. I convinced my editor to let me investigate the legend of the Dogman under the guise of a human interest piece. But for me, it was personal. I needed to know if my father's disappearance was connected to the town. The journey to Blackthorn Hollow was uneventful at first. The asphalt gave way to gravel, and then to a dirt road lined with ancient trees. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the valley in shadow, the air grew heavier, charged with an almost tangible tension. The town was eerily quiet. Its streets were empty, the buildings worn and weathered. I checked into the only inn, a creaky establishment run by a woman named Mrs. Hargrove. Her eyes were sharp, her demeanor cautious. "You're not from around here?" she said, her voice tinged with suspicion. "No," I admitted. "I'm here to write about the Dogman." Her expression darkened. "You'd do well to leave it alone. Some things aren't meant to be dug up." That night, I pored over my father's old delivery logs, tracing his last route through the area. The final entry was vague, marked only as Blackthorn Drop. It didn't specify a location. Frustrated but determined, I decided to explore the forest the next morning. The woods were dense, the towering trees blocking out most of the sunlight. The air was cool and damp, the ground carpeted with moss and fallen leaves. I followed an overgrown path, its edges marked by deep claw marks on the trees. Whether they were natural or not, I couldn't tell. Hours passed with no sign of anything unusual. But as I turned a bend in the path, I stumbled upon a clearing. At its center stood a derelict cabin, its roof caved in and windows shattered. The sight sent a chill down my spine. It was the cabin from the photos in my father's delivery logs. Inside the cabin was a ruin. Dust coated every surface, and the floorboards creaked under my weight. I found a ledger tucked beneath a collapsed table. It listed deliveries to BH with cryptic notes: special cargo, restricted access. My father's name appeared several times. Before I could process the implications, a low growl resonated from the woods. It was deep, guttural, and too close for comfort. My heart raced as I stepped outside, scanning the tree line. The growl came again, followed by the unmistakable sound of something massive moving through the underbrush. It emerged slowly, its silhouette monstrous against the fading light. The creature stood nearly 8 feet tall, its muscular frame covered in matted fur. Its elongated snout revealed sharp teeth, and its glowing amber eyes locked onto mine. It was the Dogman, and it was real. I backed away, my mind racing. The beast didn't move, as if sizing me up. I raised my hands, hoping to show I meant no harm. "I'm just looking for answers," I said, my voice trembling. About my father. The creature tilted its head, a disturbingly human gesture. Then, to my astonishment, it howled a long, mournful sound that seemed to echo my grief. Before I could react, it turned and bounded into the woods, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. Shaken, I returned to the inn. Mrs. Hargrove was waiting, her expression grim. "You saw it, didn't you?" I nodded. It knew about my father." She sighed. "The dogman doesn't hunt without reason. It guards the hollow, protects
Its secrets. Your father got too close to something he shouldn't have. Like what? I demanded. She hesitated, then said, "There are things in these woods older than the town, older than us. Your father stumbled into their world."
Some are not meant to return. I left Blackthorn Hollow the next morning, my mind a whirlwind of questions. The dogman's mournful howl haunted me, a reminder that some mysteries are beyond our understanding. My father's fate remained a mystery, but one thing was clear. The beast was not just a legend. It was a guardian, a symbol of the unexplainable, forces that still linger in the forgotten corners of the world.